Hey, it's Mark from Power BI at Work. Thank you for joining another video. And in this video, we're going to take a break from the classic star schema retail model, and we're going to visit how to reproduce a classic income statement using Power BI that is not only going to be interactive, but it's going to give us all of the rows that you see here in this classic flat file version of the income statement, specifically including gross profit. Now, when I started using or experimenting with creating an online or interactive version, I used Power Pivot to create this pivot table. And of course, it didn't take long for someone to call me up and go, "We've got everything we need. We need also those subtotals." So what I'm going to do is go to my sample file here where I have a sample GL model, and I'm just going to walk through the model and some specifics on the dimension tables, and then we're going to jump right into the measure and walk through what that measure is doing, not only to make it comparative year over year, but also to squeeze those subtotal rows into our result. And so you'll see that I have the classic model here. It looks like a star schema. Instead of having sales down here, we're looking at GL transactions. And up here, you'll notice I have a number of dimension tables that relate to the GL table. Specifically for this video, we're going to concentrate on the fiscal time table and the financial order table that's going to give us that order of presentation on our income statement. Let's start out by looking a bit at the fiscal time table. And what I'm going to point out there is that I've created a calculated column over here that just identifies the relevant rows to the transactions in our GL table. And the way that I did that was created a calculated column in this table so we know we have row context. So I need to use calculate to wake up filter context so it can use the columns from this row or from each of these rows to go back and filter our GL table for those surviving rows that relate to each one of the month rows here that you see. And so because I'm using filter context, you can see that I'm pulling back amounts or not based on the month and year in this table. And then I'm just feeding that variable called total into a second variable that checks and says, if total is blank, leave it blank. If it's not, and you find transactions or a GL total sum here, identify it with a flag text or flag string in the column. And you can see here that if we sort by month, calendar year, let's just sort this column, we'll isolate those rows in our GL that are related to this calendar table here that's identifying per month. And so we can see here, if we just go through these months, you can see that we start down here at the beginning of our fiscal year, which for us is July. So we've got a full fiscal year going from July up through June of 2019. And then we start over with a new fiscal year from July. But you'll notice that we stop just shy of the end of that year in May. And that's going to become important as we talk about our time intelligence. The next table that I want to go through and touch on is the financial order. This can be system generated. We happen to maintain our own file that represents the financial statement grouping labels as well as the line labels. And the purpose of this table is threefold. It's to provide the dimension names for our visual. It's to provide the presentation order of both the group names and the line names. And then the third purpose of this table is to identify a flag column that is going to let us, through our DAX, identify in this table when we're on a subtotal row and when we're not on a subtotal row. And you can see here that part of this dimension that's customized is that I've injected lines in here that represent margin, marginless payroll, net before allocation, and net income. If this is a system generated file, I may need to append this with my own subtotal rows in Power Query or however you see fit. Ideally, it would be at the source, but you can see here that as I've injected my own custom rows here, I've identified them with custom group order with a custom group order number that represents 2.5. So these, that says 20, that could very easily say 19.5 if I don't want to disrupt a predetermined order for the group names and the line names. So a little trick there just to kind of squeeze these in between a predetermined table. All right, well, with that, let's go to the matrix visual and let's see that I've just simply pulled in a measure, which is the sum of the amount. And it's just a simple measure, an aggregation that goes through the filters that are coming from the financial statement order table. So these are coming from this table right there. That's where those group names and those line names are coming from. And you can see that that's creating filter context from the canvas, and it's going into the GL table and it's pulling back the aggregated amounts for each of those lines. It's just a simple aggregation over my GL. There's no time intelligence, just all of the totals in the entire file. Well, we don't see margin here anywhere, even though we put it in our financial order table. One way that we could envision this is that we could go up here and we could say that I want to see items that have no data. Show items with no data. So now we're looking at items that are valid lines in our GL, but happen to not have transaction rows in the GL table. Well, included in these filters are my injected subtotals. So I've got a group called margin, I've got a line called margin, and obviously when it's filtering the GL table from this canvas, it's going to filter that GL table and find that there are no surviving rows. But the point here that I want to make is that there's a filter. So regardless of there being no results in the GL table, there is a filter that is being evaluated through from that dimension table, which should give us the idea that if there's a filter in there at some point, we could possibly change the result of this evaluation. We're not just stuck with accepting that there's no rows in our GL table that happen to be called margin, which they're not. So that's going to be important in our measure as we walk through the DAX in generating these subtotals. All right, I'm going to take that filter off and we're just going to go back here. And now we're going to remove this simple measure and we're going to replace it with a measure that I'm going to walk through. I'm not going to type it live, but I decided that it was probably best to pre-write it out and break it out into sections and just kind of walk through it. So what I've done is I've created this measure with a number of variables. And the first group of variables up here relate to the time intelligence. My goal is to replicate a financial statement that looks like my original PDF. I want to have current year totals here, fiscal year to date amounts there, but then I want to have the corresponding prior year amounts as well. So if I'm only through the month of May here, and I know my fiscal year goes through June, I want my prior year to pace the same way. I want my prior year to also only go through May. So time intelligence is involved there. And so going back to our measure, you'll see that the first grouping of my measure involves identifying time intelligence constants that are going to be used in my measure. The first one is identifying what current year we're in. And so you'll remember in my fiscal time, I added a calculated column that filtered my GL table to identify which months in that timetable were related to actual transactions in my GL table or not. And so I identified those with the string flag in that column. And in my measure, I'm identifying the max of those filtered rows in the time table that relate to GL. And that's what's allowing me to bring back the max or the current fiscal year right there. Well, since I want my prior year to pace with just the months that I've have logged or have recorded in my current fiscal year, I'm also going to have a variable here that identifies the max or the current month sequence that we're currently in this current year. So you can see here that I have calculate the max month sequence number. And then, of course, again, I'm only interested in those rows in that timetable that relate to actual transactions appearing in my GL table. So those are the time intelligence variables. We're going to come back and use those in this variable right here. This is now where we're creating math where I want to aggregate the total of the amount column in my GL, but I want to, as a developer, get in front of it and hand it filter tables here. So the first filter table is saying, I'm only interested in amount rows in the GL table where the fiscal year is equal to my current year as defined up here. I've got the current fiscal year, and then the second filter here, which I'll remind us evaluates to a table of numbers, says the filter argument or the filtered table here to use over my model should be a listing of all of the month numbers in my timetable that relate to the current one and the months that came before it. So I've got a current year, a one cell, one figure table, followed by a table that finds the current month and includes all the months that come prior. So this is a year to date custom time intelligence formula right here. Well, we also know that our objective is to add custom subtotals, including the gross profit margin. And we remember that we added it to our financial statement order table. We went to our visual and we saw that when we show dimension rows with no data or blanks, we know that filter is in there. And so we know that through the evaluation of this measure, it's going to go through every row in the dimension table, regardless of there not being a transaction record in our GL table. That means we have the opportunity to instruct our measure what to do when it runs upon that injected subtotal row. And so here's where the magic happens. Here's where the measure is. It's going to be very similar to this regular measure up here that I've called line amount or filtered financial statement line, but it's going to represent math or evaluation over the new subtotal financial statement lines. And in order to do that, we need to calculate the max order. So we're talking about the line order from the thin order table. And then the math behind this is going to be just like the one above it. Calculate the sum of the amount from the GL table, but I want to isolate it to the current year and the current months and all the months that came before it. So I can already see I'm missing that. And I also want to add a filter that says, instead of bringing back whatever you think is filtered for the title margin, which is going to be nothing, I want to customize this measure and change the filter context to include all of the lines in the financial order table that come before the current line. And so if I'm sitting on the gross margin line and it's evaluating that line right here as I believe it's 20. Let's go look real quick. Financial statement for gross profit margin is order number 20. If we're sitting in 20 here, then I wanted to create a table of all those order numbers that come before 20. And so this is a table as a filter argument in my calculate. And instead of returning a blank for that filtered margin row, what it's going to do is overwrite our original filter and replace it with the rows from the financial order dimension that start with margin but include the order lines that come before it. Okay? And then the last section of my margin is simply time to make a decision. And we're just going to toggle between if we're on a natural filtered line from the financial statement or our brand new injected margin line. And it's just going to make a decision based on the selected value of that flag column from the financial order line. If we go back there really quick, we can see that the values are 1 and 2, right? And so we're going to evaluate when the selected item or the selected value, which represents the distinct single value that DAX identifies, if that is 1, so that means we are in this row because that is going to be the only row in our visual that evaluates to a distinct number of just 1. Then it's going to pull back the second part of that measure that goes up into that dimension table, overwriting the natural original filter context of that margin row in that dimension table. And it's going to overwrite it with an evaluation of all the financial line order numbers that come before it. And so we've got it right here, selected value, flag or blank. So this result here of this variable is going to be 1 or 2 because that's what we've defined in our dimension table. And then down here, this is our result. If the flag evaluates to 1, then we're sitting on a subtotal line. And I want you to use this measure right here. I want you to override the filter coming from the canvas, and I want you to replace it with this modified measure that totals everything that came before that line. Otherwise, I want to return the line amount. And so what that's going to do in our table, bear with me, is that every time it hits a 1, so it hits a 1 right there, it's going to identify that order number and it's going to create a table of 19 through 1, and it's going to replace that margin with the result of the total GL amount 19 through 1. Well, we have other subtotals too. We have all the way down here, we have net before allocation. It's going to do the same thing here. It's going to see that flag of 1 and it knows to kick over to that secondary measure where it's going to look over here and look and see that we're on order line 74. And now the math is going to be from here all the way up. And so we should have dynamic subtotals based on this flag field over here when we drag our result into our visual. So you'll see now we have valid evaluation over the GL because we stepped in and modified it when the filter context runs into that row that is being filtered at some point, even if the result's blank. But in this case, it evaluates to that custom total that's going to subtotal everything that came before it. So we've got margin there that is the net between sales and cost of goods sold. And then we come down here, there's another one there for fun, margin minus payroll. And then we have another one down here that's net before allocation. It's doing the same thing, except it's waking up and it's looking at that line number 74 that we saw in that table, and it's summing up all the lines that came before it. So it looks like to the user that this is just working naturally, right? It just looks like it was meant to work over this income statement, even though there's some trickery going on in the background with DAX. All right, so well, we've got that one, and what I've done is I've included the month and the year as a drill down here so we can see how far it goes. And so if you remember when we looked at our timetable went from the start of our fiscal year all the way stopping short of June, and we ended in May. So we're pretending that in this current year, we've got results through month 11 in our fiscal year. Now, the beauty of this is that we can use this same measure here in our prior year comparison measure. It's exactly the same. The only difference is up in here in the time intelligence area, what I did is I took the max fiscal year that represented our current year, subtracted by 1, right? And then likewise, I took the max or the current month of evaluation, which remember in the current year evaluates to month 11. And I am simply offsetting or adjusting this back 1 year. So when I add this measure into our matrix, you can see that now when I drill into September, even though I have a full year in this prior year, sorry, went too far. That was customer name. Even though I have 11 months here, and actually in my GL table, I have a full 12 months of activity because we had to get through 12 months in order to start transacting in the current year. But because of that month sequence variable in this measure here that evaluates current year, and just simply offsetting that going back 12 months, I'm able to pace this current year, but in the prior year. And so that's a nice way of proving out that every month that is recorded in the current year is going to be released for this visual in the prior year. Another nice thing about this type of comparison is that if I just have this unfiltered, it is continually showing me year-to-date figures. But if I want to come back here and I want to see a specific month, say April, I can see a month-over-month comparative here of just the month of April. If I want to roll the year-to-date calculation back, and we don't have June in here yet, but we do have May, I can go backwards and see prior year-to-date financial statements by just simply choosing my month names up here in the slicer. All right, so that is the basics of setting up an income statement that is comparative year over year, including subtotals. I wanted to take a second before we end the video and show you this income statement here. The purpose of creating a Power BI version of the income statement for me isn't to replace the paper-based version that may have come out of finance since the start of time and be considered the gospel in our company, but rather to create an online interactive version that helps us gain insights over this document right here. So the way that I use this with readers is that we get this paper-based out and we compare it to the online version that we just created. Not only are we mirroring the current amounts and the prior year amounts, but we're also including these percentages that you see here next to these columns that represent the percentage of each line as compared to the net revenue line. So that was part of that paper version that we wanted to replicate here in the online version. In addition to that, we can also build in variance columns that represent year-over-year changes by dollar as well as by percent. So you can see we've got the change by dollars and the change by percent right there. Beyond that, what makes this meaningful for a user is adding conditional fields here over the variances, where now when we're looking at the paper-based version and we're comparing it to the online version, we're able to talk about favorable and unfavorable changes in our income statement. So if we are looking at the income statement and we're scrolling down in this activity reader, we're able to see that we have an unfavorable change year to date on repairs and maintenance. If I as a user want to learn more about this, I might consider adding helper visuals for my reader, including line charts like this and month over month comparisons like this, where I'm able to go down to that line, identify it pretty quickly, and select it there, and then instantly see a line chart that shows me that that unfavorable change happened in March and continued through the end of the fiscal year. Well, looking at this table, I'm also able to see amounts separated out by month where I can see clearly that it started in March. I can drill into March and I can see this field right here, which is a nice combination or concatenation of different fields in my model. So you can see that this is just a combination of a vendor name, Jax, with a document number, 4008, as well as a description coming from the GL itself. And so this makes for a nice drill in where I'm able to read on one single line in a separate table what is going on. And so if we read this, we see that we paid Jax as a vendor. The document was 4008 and the GL description was a capital project entry. It wasn't necessarily an income statement expense. So right off the bat, it's giving me insights over the paper version where I'm able to make a more educated phone call or email into accounting or whoever is responsible for this project and start off ahead of the curve with a tool like this rather than just looking at balances change month over month and having to wonder or go back and forth multiple times with my departments. All right, well, that concludes the video. I appreciate you sticking through, working through the DAX portion of this. I've gotten a lot of mileage out of this model in a very practical way with financial statement users. It really speeds up gaining insights and making corrections and setting goals in the organization. All right, please like the video. I appreciate all the subscribers and the comments that I'm getting. If you want to see another video about the income statement and how to further develop this out, please leave that in the comments. I'd be happy to do that. Again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. See ya.